My name is Elizabeth Tierney, and I recently wrote a book which was published by Oak Tree Press called Dignifying Dementia, a Caregiver's Struggle. It's the story of my husband's diagnosis, deterioration, and ultimately death from a form of dementia. And there are many forms of dementia. Most of us are familiar with Alzheimer's, but there's also Parkinson's with dementia, there's Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, there are many strokes. Tragically, the statistics are showing us that by 2040, over 80 million people will be suffering from some form of dementia, and the diagnosis could be occurring every 7 seconds. I wrote the book to tell you Jim's story, and it is our story, because I was lonely, I was frustrated, at times desperate. I didn't always ask the right questions, and I made a lot of assumptions. It began when I took Jim to the hospital, to the emergency room for a problem that he had, and what I'm going to call indifferent physician pulled me aside and said, "Your husband has dementia." I was taken aback. I couldn't believe it. Who is that? The man walked down the hall. Jim was treated for his ailment. I went home. I was a wreck. The next morning, I went to the hospital and saw our regular physician who was doing his rounds. And I told him what the ER doc had said, and he said, "Just watch how he handles the checkbook." What? Watch how he handles the checkbook? I handle the checkbook. The tragic reality is that that original diagnosis, that offhand remark, was correct. Jim did have a form of dementia. But over the next 4 years, we desperately tried to get an actual diagnosis. We were told he had cognitive decline, we were told he had Parkinson's, we were told he had Alzheimer's, we were told he had brain shrinkage. And many of the doctors were indifferent, treated him with absolutely no concern, no empathy, no compassion, made short shrift of him, made him do the mini mental status test, subtract from 100 by threes or name as many animals as you can. He was told not to go to tragedies and when we went to the theater, but to go to comedies instead. We were actually told by one physician that we shouldn't buy a boat or a 10,000 square foot house. Eventually, we found a wonderful physician who treated Jim like a gentleman and talked to him and treated him with respect. And they believed that Jim had one form of dementia called Lewy body, which is unfortunately 20% of dementias. Jim deteriorated slowly. Over the time, a man who used to walk quickly slowed down. By the end of his life, he was in a wheelchair. The man who loved a good glass of wine and frutti di mare pizza eventually became a drooling man who could only eat soft foods and could no longer eat a strawberry. Jim, who absolutely adored to read, who threw me out of the house to go have coffee with a friend if in fact he didn't have a chance to finish reading this book. He'd say, "Sweetie, go find a friend to have coffee with. I need to finish my book." Eventually, all he could do with a book was to take a magazine and put it on his head like a hat. As Jim deteriorated, he became more difficult. He became more confused. He became paranoid. He was hallucinating. He didn't know who I was. I had multiple names. I was Frank. I was Sean. He would say, "Who are you?" Depending on what room I was in, I was one person or another. The driver of the car was another person. I stole his money. He needed the police. He had no money. He needed to go home. And I was exhausted. Finally, I went to someone I knew who worked at an Alzheimer's association, And I said, please, I can't do this. And she said, you need to get help. Fortunately, I had long-term care insurance. And I called the agency, and then I called home health agencies, thinking, just like with the physicians, they would know how to help me and help Jim. I thought they were trained. And I called the agencies and I said, my husband has dementia, could you come over? And they said, from when to when? I hadn't even thought about that. And then when I saw the first aides that came to help Jim, and I would stay typically for about an hour until they got used to him, and then I'd go leave them alone and come back. And in the first few months, Jim was even more miserable than when I was there with him. We had aides who tied his shoelaces together because he played with them. They didn't know how to dress him. They couldn't put his glasses on him. They would fall asleep while he roamed around the apartment. I had one person who clearly surfed the net because they were looking at a rapper's website. The TV was on soap operas. One person actually said to me, I said, please talk to him. Please talk to him. He's slow, but please talk to him. And she looked at me and said, oh, you want me to treat him like a real person. As hard as it was to find doctors, and eventually we did, as hard as it was to find aides in the house, eventually we did, and we found angels. People who actually taught me, who could ask one of Jim's hallucinations to leave. If Jim needed 3 showers or wanted 3 showers, he was given 3 showers. They paid attention to him. He could no longer speak in any kind of understandable language, but they listened, they paid attention, they hung on his words, they gave him books, even if he didn't know which side of the book to open. Jim's disease took 9 years to kill him. And this is the story of that entire process. I was lonely, confused, uneducated, desperate. And this book is designed to help those of you who are going through this to know that you don't have to be as alone as I felt, that there are other people going through this. If you'd like to comment, I can be reached on the website at www.dignifyingdementia.wmv. Thank you.